So this is a recorded session and it will be available on the Politics website, but also on YouTube under the Politics page. We can also share the link to this for everybody who's registered. You will get a link of the recorded webinar after the webinar is done. I think we should, without further ado, start this very interesting conversation. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. A very warm welcome to the I Know Politics webinar series. The International Knowledge Network for Women in Politics is a joint collaboration between International IDEA, UN Women, IPU, and UNDP. It is supported by the EU under the Wide Women's Leadership Initiative. And like I said, for all those joining us today, thank you. And I would encourage you to add your questions in the comment section, and we will look at them at the end of the discussion. But also, please tell us where you're joining us from and give us a bit of an introduction so we know who all is a part of this discussion today. Our topic today is From Tokenism to Transformation, Achieving Gender Parity in Politics for the Next Generation. We're very pleased to be doing this at a very important occasion, which is the International Women's Day. On 8th March, the world celebrates the International Women's Day. We're doing this a bit in advance, but the discussion is critical to the themes of this day. I am joined by Dr. Mona Lena Crook, who is a distinguished professor of political science and chair of Women in Politics PhD program at the Rutgers University. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we have invited her not only to share insights from her years of experience in this field, but also due to her recently published groundbreaking research, a book on Elect Women for a Change, The Path to Gender Parity in Politics. Backed by empirical data, her work provides critical insights into how nations can move from aspirational goals to concrete actions in achieving political gender parity. A very warm welcome, Dr. Mona. It's lovely to have you. And I would give you the floor now to sort of, give us an overview of the book that and the research that you've published recently. What are the key insights? What should we be looking forward to, reading when we get the book soon?
Wonderful, thank you. I have a short presentation, so I'll just share my screen here. And come to here. Let's see here. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me so that we can celebrate International Women's Day together, talking about gender parity. So this is a book that just came out last week, and it really encapsulates all in one place all the ideas, reflections, insights that I've had over the last 25 years working on this topic as an academic, but also with policymakers, politicians, civil society organizations around the world, specifically on this question of how to promote the equal representation of women in politics. So over the last 30 years, since 1995, we have seen dramatic shifts in the political representation of women around the globe. So this is some data from the Interparliamentary Union, which shows us that over time, the share of women in national parliaments has doubled and even tripled in some regions in this very short amount of time. And these are just averages across the different regions. Some countries even do better than that. Today, there are 6 countries that have now elected 50% or more women to parliament, and nearly 30 have elected 40% or more. At the same time, these numbers overall continue to fall short of parity. And so the question is, where do we go? Where do we go from here? And so my book tries to provide a roadmap focusing on barriers to women's political representation, but also the arguments and the tools that we can use to achieve gender balance in political life. In just the last few years, we have seen UN member states agree unanimously to the goal of 50-50 representation. This was in the agreed conclusions to the 2021 Commission on the Status of Women meetings. happen every year. That year, the focus was on women in public life, equal participation in decision making. We also saw at the end of 2024 a new general recommendation from the Committee on the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women on the equal and inclusive representation of women in decision making. It's not limited only to politics, but politics is a very important part of this. If we look at Article 7 of the CEDAW Convention, it's about women's participation, as voters in elected and appointed positions, and also in all areas of sort of the state bureaucracy. And in that new general recommendation, we see an argument from the CEDAW committee arguing that governments are obliged to promote 50-50 representation. For a long time, 30% has been the goal, but the committee states very forcefully here in the general recommendation that 30% is incompatible with the convention, right? Because the convention is about eliminating all forms of discrimination, right? So we're sort of accepting less than equal representation. So it's sort of part of that normative argument that we are seeing appearing in different parts of the world. And finally, last year we saw a declaration from the IPU's Global Conference of Women Parliamentarians calling for gender parity, right? To take deliberate, concrete actions to advance gender parity in political life. At the national level, we've also seen a growing number of countries adopt 50-50, laws for 50-50 representation. The first was France in 2000, but now similar laws have spread to many parts of Latin America. They're very specific. It has to be 50-50 in terms of the nomination of candidates. We've also seen states, mainly in Western Europe, adopt provisions for what I would call flexible parity. So this is the idea that we should have at least 40% or no more than 60% of either sex, right? So it's like it allows us for that mathematical possibility that maybe there's an odd number of seats, right? So how do we achieve parity? So flexible parity is a really big part, of the laws that we see in Western Europe. But from those tables, you can see these discussions have expanded to other parts of the world as well. All right, so if we take this all together, we see that there is a growing global movement for gender parity. And so what this book tries to do is to be an intervention where I thought I could contribute at least to, building this momentum. Because as I said, I'm an academic, but I've also engaged extensively with policymakers around the world. So the book really tries to bring together all these diverse sources of knowledge to help us build the case and to find the strategies that will promote parity. So the book starts with, this are just the different chapters in the book. So the book starts with an overview of the global parity movement. It outlines the different international frameworks in support of this goal, and actually makes an argument that the Beijing Declaration from 1995, which is often associated with the 30% goal, is actually making the case for 50-50 representation as well, right? So this has actually been part of the discussion for a long time. It's actually not something new, but we've seen these explicit commitments to parity coming in the last few years. Then I develop the concept of parity, like what is it that we're talking about when we talk about gender parity? And I define it in terms of 3 dimensions of access, power, and diversity. Then I talk about the benefits of parity, why we should all care about parity as a goal. I show how it can advance equality and human rights. It can promote qualified and diligent politicians, foster more responsive public policy, increase democratic legitimacy, and encourage gender equality in other spheres. The book then goes on to explain why we don't yet have parity. If it's a good thing, why don't we have it? And focus specifically on 3 barriers of socialization, discrimination, and backlash. And then there is a chapter, which is the longest chapter in the book, which outlines strategies used globally to counteract these 3 barriers, right? So thinking about how do we counteract socialization, discrimination, and backlash in turn. And then the book ends with a global call to action, arguing that everyone can do something to advance parity, right? It's not something that we have to wait for other people to do, but there's something that we can all play in terms of sort of helping to move this movement along to achieve 50-50 representation. Across the chapters, I make four main arguments. So the first is that parity is about more than numbers. This is obviously the easiest way to measure progress, but numbers don't capture the whole picture. And I argue that parity has three important, interrelated, and non-negotiable components. Okay, so women and men must have equal access to political office, so both elected and appointed. Women and men should have equal power in politics, and that's in terms of leadership and influence, the ability to have a voice in politics, to shape the political agenda. And third, women and men must be represented in their full diversity in terms of, depending on the country, race, ethnicity, sexuality, age, disability. There are other possibilities as well. And that's really about making sure that parity is for all women, right? Not just a subgroup of maybe women who are already privileged, right? But women as a whole. What this definition really stresses is that the demand for 50-50 representation falls short if it does not also prioritize meaningful and inclusive participation. The second argument is that parity is not a panacea. It has benefits, but we can't expect it to solve all the world's problems. And parity has not failed if we haven't changed all the world's problems, right? The world is very difficult to change. And so I want to be very clear that promoting women in politics does not guarantee, right, that the world is going to change overnight. But if we want to change the world, electing and appointing women is a very good place to start. Third, patriarchy, the words are so similar, patriarchy undermines parity. Ideas about gender inequality are infused across all of our social, economic, and political structures. And this creates ongoing resistance to any efforts to change the status quo, right? So even when we are making progress, patriarchy is always there trying to pull us backwards. So an example is violence against women in politics. Before the widespread adoption of gender quotas, resistance was about keeping women out, right? Just not nominating them or supporting their candidacies. But as more and more women have been elected over the last few decades, this resistance has become more visible, using tactics like violence, harassment, intimidation to try to push women back out, right? So that is resistance, right? But now it's becoming very visible and very nasty and traumatic for women who want to engage in politics. And fourth, parity requires action. So given the barriers of socialization, discrimination, and backlash, I argue that we won't achieve anything until we take deliberate steps to reconfigure the political world. I mean, and this is true everywhere, even in places like the Nordic countries where women have long had very high levels of women's political representation. And sometimes people say they have that because of favorable background conditions. But the fact is, and this is something I'm writing another book about, there have been long-standing efforts by women across many decades inside and outside the political parties to elect more women, right? So I think even those cases really show us that action is needed, and it is the only way that we are going to make big leaps forward. So I think I'll just end, I guess, by saying that we're currently in a moment of backlash against gender equality. And I think this is not the time to abandon parity as a goal. I think that parity is needed more than ever. And I really hope that you will join me in trying to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mona. This was so interesting, and I'm now really looking forward to reading this book because of all the different aspects that you've covered. And something really, that stood out for me, which brings me to my first question also, is about you mentioned how parity is more than numbers, and that's very true. Because you can have a certain number of women in the parliament, but does that really mean that they have the access and the power to drive the agenda? that is needed for, equal representation or a better society or for a better democracy for that matter. So my question to you is, how do we measure parity in terms of access, power, and diversity? Um, because, there's this whole idea of uh, parity moving beyond numbers. How would
Mhm.
what is your understanding of this?
Yeah, so I think this is a very important question, and it gets to the issue of data, right? The only way that we can know if we are making any progress is if we have measures that we can use to see whether or not things are changing, or even to measure like where we are now as a starting point. Globally, the main metric is numbers, and so you see like Interparliamentary Union has been collecting this data since the 1990s, but even measures for the Sustainable Development Goals. It measures women's political empowerment in terms of the number of women in parliament and local government. If we looked at the World Economic Forum, they look at the number of women in parliament, but also the presence of woman national leader. So it's all about numbers, and I think that is an important part of the process, but we need to think more sort of beyond that, because I think we are seeing, I think, a troubling development where countries sort of use their high numbers of women in politics to sort of claim that they are more democratic or more inclusive than they actually are. So I think numbers can tell us something, but they don't tell us everything. In terms of power, I think that's obviously a very difficult concept to measure. But in the book, I talk about two things. So one is to think about women in leadership positions, right? So if women are elected to parliament, do they just remain as the rank and file, or do they become, presidents or chairs of parliamentary committees? Are they part of the leadership? Do they become speakers of parliament, right? Are they, outside of parliament, are they leaders of political parties, right? These kinds of issues. Are they cabinet ministers? Are they, a prime minister's president? So I think leadership is very important to keep in mind. The second side has to do with portfolios in question. So we know that the vast majority of ministers for gender equality, women's empowerment tend to be women, right? Women tend to hold portfolios in family and children's affairs and social inclusion and development. On the other side, they tend to be much less likely than men to hold portfolios on religion, defense, finance. And so I think that for us to have parity, right, women have to be able to contribute to discussions on defense, right, the same way that men have to be able to just, contribute to discussions on development, right? So parity would be really about being able to have a voice in all areas, right? Not just in some areas, even though they're important, right? Development is very, very important. Education, those are portfolios that are often associated with women, but we want to make sure that women have a voice in all areas. So for me, that would be how to measure power. And then third, in terms of diversity, this is really about looking at the other aspects of representatives' backgrounds. Obviously ethnicity, age, disability, etc. And if we look at the data, this intersectional data on political representation, for example, like majority ethnic, minority ethnic men and women, majority ethnic men are vastly overrepresented in parliaments around the world. Minority men are kind of roughly proportionally represented. They're the same share of the population as they are in parliament. Majority women are underrepresented, but minority women are the most underrepresented of all, right? And we see the same pattern happen for young people, and other areas as well. So that's another way that we can measure that. And luckily, we're starting to get new sources of data that enable us to understand like the age of representatives, ethnic backgrounds, etc.
Thank you. Yes. That's very interesting, of course, because the intersectionality of this is very important to consider. And
Mm-hmm.
who are the most vulnerable and who are the most marginalized, and that somehow tend to be always, women from minorities. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'll sort of, move to the next question, but also it's very closely tied to this. You talked about socialization. You talked
Yeah.
about how certain portfolios, for example, at the ministerial level, are already considered to be more, pro were women, they're always usually given to women. Gender, for example. And what what is understood in, our from our understanding, gender is not just a women issue. It's the when it actually started, it's when people start taking it as an issue that impacts both men and women, is when we will actually be, working on it properly. So how do you think socialization and discrimination, especially considering the backlash that you've spoken about, how does it
Hmm.
specifically impact young women? Because we're also, looking at a minority. Young women tend to be the most vulnerable. And then if you have add the intersectionality of young women with disabilities or young women from religious minorities or ethnic young women, we see a very vulnerable and marginalized community when it comes to political participation. So how does socialization sort of play into this? You know, and impacting their ambitions, impacting their political participation and representation generally in politics.
Hmm. Um, yeah, so what I would say is that I think the easiest way to understand this, or just to start with, is to acknowledge that patriarchy tries to divide the world into two spheres, the public sphere and the private sphere. So the public sphere of politics, business, the economy tends to be seen as a space for men. And on the other side, we have the private sphere of the home and the family, and that tends to be associated more with women. And this divide really creates a very big, I would say, poses a dilemma for women who want to engage in politics, right? Because that's a sphere that they allegedly, where they don't belong. And so, that has happened through history, but we still see the remnants of that divide today, right? So when women run for office, there's always these questions about, well, like, what about her children, right? How is she combine, and then there's the practical issues of how do you combine work-life balance to be able to be a good politician, but also to be a good mother or family member. And so that really creates these very, difficult and very difficult barriers that parliaments around the world are increasingly trying to do through gender-sensitive reforms. But it's still there in society, telling women that maybe that shouldn't be their first priority in terms of what they do with their lives. I think that, so that leaves, in terms of socialization, women are sort of taught that politics is not a place for them. Discrimination is where elites are looking at women candidates and saying, actually, I don't think this woman is qualified, even if she has the same qualifications as a man, right? So like they'll choose men. And then backlash is really about when the patterns are under threat, right? Like they're changing, right? There's more and more women going into the public sphere. Backlash is like trying to reset it back to the patriarchal status quo, right? And so that's what, if you look at efforts to different kinds of forms of violence against women in politics, they're always about like go back to the home, go back to the kitchen, right? Or sexualizing women like their places, in the private sphere as well, right? So there's like, or all the words that we use, the slurs that you use for women who are in public spaces, like they're prostitutes, or all these kinds of things they're all traced back to the patriarchy. So I think that's a really really big part of what's happening, and it's happening within women, within society, right, and within those who are challenged by the changes. I think for young women, some of these challenges are even heightened more, right? So being a woman, already kind of face this challenge that you're seen as less qualified. But if you're a young person, right, you can also be seen as like, well, maybe you're not ready, right? And so we know from interviews and other work with young women and young men in parliament, that young women feel that they are doubly marginalized. They're given few opportunities. It's interesting though for young men is that sometimes for them their youth becomes an advantage, right? Because they might have men in positions of power who sort of see themselves in these young guys, and they pull them up, right? So they have the mentors who are kind of furthering their political careers. But young women do face this challenge, right, to be taken seriously in politics. We also have evidence that violence against women in politics has a particularly strong impact on young women. So young women are targeted more for violence, but it also has bigger implications for all of us because what we're learning now is, women inside of political parties, women in the youth wings, they experience all this violence that leads them to say, actually, I want to continue working in politics, but I'm not going to put myself forward as a candidate, right? So it's not because they're not interested in politics. It's just that they sort of see that violence as the cost of moving ahead. And they'd rather just preserve, their sanity, their mental health, and stay out of politics, on that public face of politics. And so what that means is that women are sort of coming out of the pipeline. Those women who are the most interested in politics are coming out of the pipeline. We also have evidence that young women are seeing how women in public life are treated, right? You can see the abuse online. You can see how the media is portraying women. You see how women are treated in political debates, right? And so they say, well, why would I want to do that? So even very young girls, right? They see that, and so that's also stopping the pipeline, right? So if violence is one of these things that's pushing out the women who are already there, it is also starting to take young women who haven't even entered the pipeline, who've just started the pipeline, and it's taking them out of the conversation as well, right? So it's not just a now question, it's a future question of women's political representation as well. And I think that's why I think it's so important to really think about how age and gender are really working together to exclude women, but especially young women from politics.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the point of online, violence. The technology facilitated gender-based violence we've seen with generative AI, how it has really exploded and what it has meant for women in politics in general, but also young women in politics in particular. So, just basing off this, what do you think in your book, and the research that you've sort of conducted? What
Mhm.
evidence-based strategies have come forward when it comes to effectively countering gender-based political violence and harassment? And of course, if you also look at this new element of technology-facilitated gender-based violence.
Yeah, so I published a book in 2020, which really tries to think about all the solutions. So this was a book that was also trying to bring in some work that I had done in the policy world together with my academic research and conversations I had with women politicians around the world. So in that book, I was talking about different kinds of violence, physical violence, psychological violence, sexual violence, etc., and then different, specific strategies for each of those types of violence, and then cross-cutting strategies that could be used to combat different kinds of violence. So I have like a very long set of examples, and those are not hypothetical examples. They're actually ones that have been employed in different parts of the world, right? So that people we kind of crowdsourced what are some of the solutions. But the conversation has continued, right? And the discussion on technology facilitated gender based violence, so TFGBV, has really advanced over the last 5 or 6 years. So we do have some further strategies that have been introduced. So I'll just mention a few interventions. So the first are we see laws on violence against women in politics. So we see some countries, this is mainly in Latin America, but also various parts of, North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, parts of Africa, like Tanzania, also has a law on violence against women in politics. So some of these laws are standalone, so they're their own legislation. But in most cases, they involve a change to a reform to the law already that exists on gender-based violence, or potentially the electoral code as well. And so those strategies, I think, have not always been effective in, just like laws on violence against women haven't always been effective in like changing and stopping violence against women. But they're there, right? So there's a potential for them to have an impact. To me, the most important thing about these laws is that they are about the state recognizing this problem, because so much of what kind of the challenge of talking about violence against women in politics is that we don't have a language to describe women's experiences, and then we also have people who dismiss it, right? Like well, it's just if you want to be involved in politics, this is just the price you have to pay. If you're in public life, you're going to be subject to attacks. And on one hand, I agree if those criticisms, if that hostility is based on a person's political, I don't know, political ideas or their political contributions, right? People should be criticized if they're not performing well, right? If they're ignoring important issues to their community. That is productive. That helps democracy move forward. What's happening with violence against women in politics, though, is that it involves these identity-based attacks. So it's not about what you're saying, but it's about who you are and your right to participate in politics. And that I think is very problematic for democracy, and we have not fully appreciated, the challenge that has made, right? And so when we look at TFGBV, technology facilitated gender-based violence, it is rarely about women's ideas in politics. It's, attacking them in these very gendered ways. It's about using deep fake technologies, to make them appear more incompetent. It's about using digital manipulation like Photoshop to portray them in these very, sexualized, humiliating, demeaning ways. You even see the circulation of fake sex tapes, in some context, which is, creates a lot of pressure on women to just leave, right? Because it's something that, it just can potentially destroy your reputation, right? And these tools are just developing now at a pace that we have just never seen before. I mean, just from year to year, there are these new technologies and ability to generate these images, and it's increasingly hard to tell the difference between what's a real image and what's a fake image. So the challenge here is really, really a big one. So currently, what I've been seeing in terms of solutions there is that in some countries, there's been an explicit statement that um, these what happens online, right? If it's the same behavior online that in real life is criminalized, then it should also be criminalized online. So, like in the UK, there's a law against intimidation, right? So, like if you're intimidating somebody in real life, or if they're not in real life, this online is also real life, in person, like directly, physically, intimidating someone. But you also if that's illegal, then that same behavior should be illegal online. So I think that's one way, right, to kind of capture, to bring the legal structure up to date in terms of this new sphere where things are happening, where people spend so much time in their everyday life, right? They're online. Um, and I think a third set of strategies has to do with digital safety trainings or digital plus in-person safety trainings. And we've seen, in countries like the United States, I know there's several organizations now currently working on, we already have many training programs for women to participate in politics, which are about, crafting a campaign message, or, how to fundraise, how to improve your public speaking skills. But, digital safety needs to be part of that, right? So how do you stay safe online, right? How do you, you know, uh, avoid people hacking your account, right? How do you report, right? You can obviously report to the platform, some of which are less good and now than they were in the past. They were never very good. Can you bring it to the police, right? What's the threshold for being able to report that to the authorities? But that is also very difficult too, because sometimes these attacks are coming from other places. There was some women I interviewed in the UK who were attacked online. And when they actually did the sort of forensics to figure it out, it turns out a lot of the attacks were coming from men's rights activists in the United States. So that kind of becomes difficult, right? Who's under what jurisdiction? These are the internet crosses national borders. So that's also a challenge, I think. But we're people I think are very actively trying to think about how to make those interventions, sort of setting the norms, figuring out how to hold people accountable for their actions online. So I feel like there's a few strategies that have emerged, but there's still a lot more work to do in this area.
Of course, and it's so important how you mentioned this just now, how patriarchy, what it does is it divides the public and the private space. And when women are pushed to go out of the, not be given their space in the public arena and forced to go into the private space, the
Mhm.
online, since the online and the offline is connected, it sort of just really becomes
Yeah.
very aggressive in the online space, not just because of the borderless ability for people to interact, but also the idea of anonymity. The online is a lot of perpetrators of violence are sometimes protected by an anonymous profile. And so how does somebody who's being attacked, how do they respond to that sort of challenge then?
Mhm.
But yes, I mean, I think the important thing is to continue to have these conversations and continue to strategize around it, because the onus of protection must not only lie on the survivor but also on the perpetrator of violence. And perhaps if we go a bit deeper into it, it goes back to the idea of socialization. It goes back to the idea of how men feel that the public space is theirs to have. It's true for the online, but also, the offline. So yeah,
Yeah, and I think that the online space is our new public sphere, right? It's like a
absolutely.
where we are participating, and there's a lot of academic research that shows that people are more disinhibited. So like online, so when if they saw somebody in person, they might hold back from insulting them,
Mm,
right? Or
absolutely.
threatening them because like you can see the person, right? And it's also like kind of, I don't know, you feel more self-conscious of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Online, it's just like going into the void, right? So
Mm-hmm.
people behave badly even more, online, or they wouldn't do it in person, but they would do it online. And that's something that people have really politicians have mentioned, right? It seems like, I talked to some women who'd been in politics for a long time, and for some of them, they were like, yeah, it's the same level of violence. It's just that there are more ways that people can do it, right? It's so
Mm-hmm.
accessible before to harass somebody, to send a letter or something. You had to like, get the paper, you have to like print it out, compose a letter, you have to find an envelope, you have to find a stamp, you have to find the address that it goes to, you have to put it in the mail, right? Like there are so many different steps that it takes that you
Mm-hmm.
could stop, kind of calm down all the way at every one of those steps. Um, but nowadays, you can just, it's on your phone, which is in your hand, most of the time, and you can just very easily find the people that you want to attack, right? And you can send them a message in real time. And on the other side, there are women who talk about like, I was in my house and in my kitchen, cooking dinner, and then suddenly, I get a notification, and you look, and then they get it right away, right? And it reaches into their private life, right? And their private
Mm-hmm.
spaces. It's not just like in public when they're in parliament or at a public meeting. So it really, it's opening it up on both sides, on the perpetrator side to do it, and on the target side to receive those messages in a very sort of direct and quick way.
Absolutely. And it immediately, like you said, for the longest time, we've had this conversation on how if you are in politics, if you're a woman in politics, this is just the price you have to pay. And it's so
Mhm.
important to sort of dismantle these narratives, because now with online violence, the fact that women in politics have become so accessible in the online space, and just the frequency and the ease with which perpetrators of violence can sort of
Mhm.
it's basically somebody's opinion. And there's also that debate of, oh, is this freedom of speech, or is this the basic human rights or basic decency for that matter?
Mhm.
So we really need to, also be aware of that. And just also on that, do you want to comment on the idea of the manosphere? Because we know that there are now specific dedicated spaces where this sort of violence is not only encouraged, it's reinforced, but also it's sort of normalized, where these conversations are, in just this is what the conversation is about why women should be not allowed to occupy the public space, or specifically when it comes to politics then.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the so-called manosphere is a real challenge. And I just saw some news stories yesterday that came out about surveys of young men and attitudes towards gender equality. And we've often thought that like every generation is going to become more accepting of gender equality. And there's some evidence that Gen Z, so those are like the young, maybe teenagers, people in their 20s, the Gen Z men are actually less progressive on gender equality, less accepting of gender equality than boomer men. So people, men born in the 1940s to the early 1960s, which is really, I think it's very troubling, right? So where are they getting their ideas? A lot of those ideas are coming through the manosphere, right? So we have had all this, efforts to try to, improve toleration and accepting diversity, advancing equity, inclusion. And now there's been this kind of pushback, right, to a so-called more traditional time. But this is, I think, where technology is giving these new resources and these new spaces for the backlash. These are places where men who might feel alone in being unhappy with their lives, right? They find common cause with these other men, right? And then they feel like I think that helps legitimize their feelings of discontent, but it also helps mobilize them. As I've come to understand that they're like, oh, this woman politician said this, right, and then they like get the whole group to start harassing. And there were some women who were saying like I couldn't even use my phone because it was like all of the notifications coming through, right? And I mean, they're not mild. They are not just like you're stupid or you're fat or you're ugly, but they're like, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to hang you, like very graphic, very, very sharp kinds of comments, right? And, some people will say, well, but, just boys being boys. And, this is just like what's out there. No, it's, it's not, right? And even if parents are there trying to socialize, their children, their teachers are trying to, socialize them, there's this like kind of alternative sphere that is increasing misogyny and anger, and also this sort of sense of entitlement, that they've lost something through gender equality, right? That's made their lives worse rather than better. And I think it is a place where this discourse becomes normalized, right? As soon as like you start to hear the same words again, which the first time might be sort of sharp, but then after a while, it's like, okay, this is just how people talk. And I think being in those kinds of spaces is really about radicalization, becoming more extreme, and sort of developing that sort of hate and feeling like that hate is justified, that you have allies and that there's this army of people who are there, right, like that are your partners in trying to dismantle gender equality. So one of the things I did, I would say somewhat related to this, is that in 2016 I was working with the National Democratic Institute, which is an NGO in Washington, D.C. And we launched the Not the Cost campaign to stop violence against women in politics. So we launched a sort of call to action, and we, identified what violence against women in politics was, different kinds of tactics we can use what different actors could do to fight against it. 5 years later, we did an updated call to action, and it was fascinating because so many of these so many of these strategies that were hypothetical then had become real. The people had actually developed different kinds of strategies and more strategies than we had thought about. But to me, what was most important thing about that campaign was to say that violence is not the cost, right? We should not just be normalizing it and saying that's just politics. So women have to change and they have to adapt. They have to accept being second-class citizens. But rather, we need to change politics, right? We need to have higher standards. We should say that politics needs to give everyone a voice, right? We should not accept efforts to try to push people out, to make them secondary, to stop them from having a voice in issues that directly affect their lives. And last week, 2 weeks ago, we launched a report with the OSCE on coping strategies of women politicians. And at the end, I asked these women, do you have any advice, right? Like for what women should do? And they all said, please stay in politics, right? It's really important that we understand that this is not personal to us. This is a structural thing about trying to keep women out. And that is why it's so important that you stay, right? It's important that you keep your voice, that you stay there and you try, if your voice wasn't important, people would not be trying to stop you, right? And so to say we can't accept it, right? We can't normalize it, and we need to demand more of our political systems, of our colleagues, our political parties, to really make this a more fair and equal place where everyone can have the same kind of voice and impact in politics.
Absolutely. And what is critical to also perhaps underline here is how this is, important for a functioning democracy. Without
Mm-hmm.
women or without equal representation of different groups in society, you are also hurting the democratic system. And so all stakeholders, we as stakeholders, all of us, everybody needs to come together and fix this issue. Because at the end of the day, what is at stake is not just gender equality, it's democracy that is also at stake. So, before I move on, by the way, I would just like to acknowledge all the participants that we have here. And also, if there are any questions that you have, please put them in the comment section, introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and we will address those questions at the end. Um, I will move to my next question now, which is about strategies on, achieving gender parity. So, according to your research, especially in your most recent work, which approaches have shown more promising results? Globally, are there best practices that we can quote in terms of achieving gender parity? Specific examples?
Mm-hmm. So I talk about a range of different strategies in this book, but I would say that the most effective strategies by far are gender quotas. This was actually the topic of my first book, which was published in 2009. At that time, there were about 100 countries that had some type of quota in place, whether it was, in a constitution, electoral law, or in a political party statute. And now, the last time I checked, it was around 140 countries. So there's many people, many countries have come on board the quota wagon. But what is really important is that not all of these measures are equally well designed. So we have learned a lot over the last 30 years about what works in terms of quotas. So there are three kinds. So one are reserved seats, which set aside seats for women for women in various kinds of political bodies. Then you have party quotas, where individual parties make a pledge to have more women among their candidates, and then legislative quotas, which are usually changes to the electoral law that require all parties to have a certain share of women. So the difference between these measures, not just kind of national and party level, but that reserve seats guarantee there's at least a minimum number of women elected, whereas the party and legislative quotas are about the candidates. So we don't always get, if you have 50% candidates, you don't always get 50% elected, right? Because there are a lot more candidates than there are people who are elected. So what we've learned is that quota design really, really matters. So the most effective quotas are those that mandate 50-50, right? If that's strict parity or flexible parity. Two, that they require alternation so that women and men are equally placed in winnable and unwinnable seats and districts. So in a list system, that would mean, alternating between men and women on your list all the way down. In a system where you have individual districts, that's about having men and women in districts that are equally winnable. So I can give the example of Mexico, which has been very, very effective. They have a mixed system where they have both lists and then they have these single member districts. In the list part, they require parity, so alternating between women and men. In the single member districts where only one person can be elected, the law actually says that parties may not place women in exclusively losing districts, right? So they can't just put women, those half women in those districts that they're never going to win. So parties trying to figure out how to implement this. decided to introduce a lottery system. So they decided, they just randomly chose the 50-50, right? And that actually managed to put women and men equally across winnable and non-winnable seats. So you end up getting perfect parity in both their Senate and their Chamber of Deputies. So that was really important. In Tunisia, which unfortunately no longer has quotas because of a change in their electoral system, they did have the parity on the list, going down the list, but because there were so many parties, initially after the Arab Spring, most parties elected just one person and they put a man at the top of the list. So you had a parity law, but it didn't elect 50% women. But what they did at the local level was that instead of just having, sorry, for local elections, it's not just what they call vertical parity, but they had horizontal parity, which meant that they're running lists in different districts. So every other district they had to have started with a man and the other one it started with a woman. And when they had horizontal and vertical parity, they also ended up electing like 48, 49% women to local councils across the country. Right. So like this question about like placing, where placement is put, that's really important. So 50-50 alternation. And third is the sanctions. Sanctions are very important. Many quota policies don't have a sanction. So if party decides not to implement it, all right, there's like nothing's going to happen to them. The places where it's most effective are where parties are the lists are rejected, right? So they cannot run in the campaign as a party unless they nominate women. So that is a very important, very effective strategy to make sure that quotas work. And this is, I think, a really, really important factor in explaining why so many countries have now reached 50%, or at least reached 40%. In 1994, right before the Beijing conference, there was one country in the world that had elected more than 40% women, and that was Sweden. And now we have countries in Africa, countries in Asia and the Middle East that have achieved 40% or more women's representation. In almost every case due to gender quotas. So I would say that that's the most effective strategy, but that strategy needs to be designed well. It needs to make sure that discrimination cannot prevent women from actually being nominated and elected to these positions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. That's very interesting. I will move to my last question now. Um, and this is just, this is your idea, or you, of course, all of these are your ideas, but like, my question is, what would a roadmap look like for achieving gender parity? So if you were in your perfect world designing this for the governments of the world, what would that roadmap look like? You've mentioned gender quotas, but what are the key steps that we need to take? And especially, how do we then also ensure that the intersectionality, we look at it from that lens of intersectionality? How do young women, how do marginalized women also be a part of this
Mhm.
agenda?
Yeah, well, so that's what I'm trying to do with this book. I mean, one of the things I found very helpful was that being in a position between like theory and practice, is that I have been able to help policymakers understand or to what the arguments are by pointing to academic research, right? So kind of highlighting the data that's there to help them make the case. And I think also for academics, for us to do the kind of work that matters, it's really helpful to have the insights of practitioners. The issue of violence against women in politics came up in the world of practice. Like nobody was writing about it in academia. And it was only a few of us who were kind of connected to practitioners that were like, this is something, right? They're talking about something. Can we help like build the concepts to make them more robust? Can we help them think about the data and how it should be collected? Right. So it's really like I think about that conversation. So when I wrote the book, I really tried to say like what would be helpful based on what I know, right? So the international frameworks, right? It's really helpful. Most countries, almost every country in the world has signed the CEDAW Convention, right? Okay, now there's like CEDAW General Recommendation 40 that says you have an obligation, right? This is a binding treaty. So that's one place. Evidence-based arguments for like why we need more women. I mean, people will say, well, women are going to be able to change all these things. Well, here's some evidence that shows you how to do that. And then, just trying to think about what if people been doing, right? We've seen huge changes. So how can we learn from each other, right? What kinds of training programs would be helpful? What kind of fundraising or, ways we could use political finance to advance women's representation or to get parties to have an incentive to nominate women. How can we do this in a way that's sensitive to diversity, right? That reaches young women, that reaches ethnic minority women, that reaches women with disabilities in ways because there are different barriers. I mean, we think about disabilities, right? It's not just a question of like the gender problems, but there's also accessibility problems, right? It's more expensive if you are a person with disabilities to run for political office, right? You need, sometimes you need assistance, you need a translator, you need certain types of transportation. So you need to think about that in both ways, right? If we want to make sure there's full diversity, it's not just about gender quotas, but it's also about, things related to what kinds of things can you claim for campaign expenses and things like that. So I try to talk about some examples in the book, but obviously I think that's a larger conversation that we will continue to have on how to make sure not just women, but diverse women are elected at all levels of politics.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much for this, Dr. Mona. This has been very, very, very interesting. Just at the end, how can we get your book? Is there a link? If where in which parts of the world is it available? Can you, speak a little bit about
Yeah,
that
I'll
so all
just
those
show
who
you. I
want to
have a
get this?
little, yeah, on my, let's just see here. If I share my screen again, it's,
Hmm.
sorry, I've got, sorry, it's the beginning of this presentation here. It's, sorry, I was just trying to get out here. It's in this page here. So you can see there's the QR code, which brings you just to the
Hmm.
publisher's page. I also have created a website just with information about the book, what's in different parts of it, at paritypolitics.org, and there's some links to the book. This book was my previous books were published by an academic press, which had a lot of availability, but this book is actually meant to be something that's kind of for a regular non-academic audience. So you can find it on Amazon from the publisher, but Amazon and also many bookstores around the world. So I hope it's accessible. I think it's a nice short book. I think it's meant to be for a broader audience. So I hope you will find that that it helps you in the work that you want to do as well.
Absolutely. No, it's very interesting, and I'm really looking forward to reading. I've already shared the link to the website that Dr. Mona mentioned. It's in the chat, so you can access the link and order the book online. But yes, again, thank you so much. And I don't see if there are no questions here. But if there's any question, please send them through. We're also sort of towards the end of this webinar. We're running out of time, but very interesting discussions, very interesting aspects. A lot of the things that you spoke about are experiences of women in politics, what they go through every day. What is critical for us to, as development practitioners, as academics, is to make sure that these experiences are reflected in the correct way, and the narratives around these are not diminishing their experience, but rather sort of reinforcing the truth of how things are for how what it means to do politics in today's world.
Mhm.
Do you have any other
I
comments?
Yeah, I would just add that I feel like there's always been enthusiasm for increasing women's representation, but I feel like there is a new buzz, a new energy around this idea of parity that is really exciting. And I think, in many ways, uh, it's innovative, but like it's building on what we've been doing before. Some people that I've talked around the world, when it was like 30% was sort of the goal that most people were working towards. A colleague from Japan talked about when she tried to mobilize for 30%, everyone was like, Why 30%? That seems kind of like random. There's no way to really justify it. So then she's like, okay, what about 50-50? And then people were like, well, okay, I can understand that. Right. And this happened, other places like in France and Sweden, right? That the resistance to these smaller proportions pushed women to have to ask for 50-50, but that was accepted more. That was more seen as more logical. And it really is a question. It really highlights the question of fairness that if women are excluded from politics, they are not enjoying the same political rights as men, right? And that
Mhm.
it's for us, for everyone to have a democracy, right? To have a voice. We need 50-50 representation. And I'm just so excited that there are so many different organizations that are really kind of coming together now. Next week, we have at the CSW meetings in New York, a meeting of all the regional organizations to talk about gender parity, how to get there, how we can work together, not just global norms, but regional norms, regional actors to develop strategies for the future. So I think it's a great time to be thinking and working on this issue because there are a lot of us who really care so much about this. And I think we'll be able to get there more effectively if we work together.
And on that very positive note, I will once again thank Dr. Mona for her incredible insights today. It was a very, very interesting discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope that everybody who joined us online did as well. We'll be sharing a link to this webinar, the YouTube link, with all the participants and also everybody else who registered and wasn't able to join today. In that same email, I think we'll also share the link to this to the book where you can get the book from. So yes, thank you again, and wonderful speaking to you. And I hope that we can have you again soon, talking to us about some other aspect of this topic in one of the upcoming webinars. Thank you so much, Dr. Mona, and everybody else.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care and have a lovely rest of the day.